On December 14th, 2014, a teenage boy is exploring the woods around the back roads of Beaver County, Pennsylvania, around 30 feet from the nearest path. It is a quiet, rarely traveled area where the nearest tarmacked road is just under a mile away, one that cuts through a residential area that hosts only around a dozen or so homes with minimal traffic, little more than a locally known shortcut to and from Route 989. The young lad is in a world of his own, enjoying the peace and tranquility of nature, completely unaware of what he is about to stumble across. He only spots what he is about to discover because it looks extremely out of place. Even among the death and decay of the Pennsylvania winter, the thing has a distinct air of morbidity about it. When he recognizes what it is, he turns on his heels and runs screaming from the woods, tears in his eyes, his heart racing in his chest. Because what he has discovered that gray December day was a severed head. Only this wasn't the disembodied head of a newly murdered person. This particular head had been embalmed and preserved. When the police finally arrived hours later, they discovered that the eyes of the severed head were shut, but the mouth was wide open. They intensively searched and surrounded the area for any signs of the body it had once been attached to, but found nothing. The head was so well preserved that its face was still distinctly recognizable, but a subsequent facial reconstruction yielded no clues to the owner's identity. Forensic examiners estimated that it had been there for between 1 week and a month, just lying there among the fallen leaves, waiting to be discovered. If the gray hairs that covered her scalp were anything to go by, it was thought that the owner of the severed head was anything from 50 to 80 years of age. An anatomy professor turned forensic artist by the name of Michelle Vitale examined the head in excruciating detail by request of the local police department. After hours upon hours of study, she came to a shocking conclusion that whoever had severed the head had done so with the skill of an expert pathologist, that they must have had some kind of anatomical training to have completed the task with such precision, a conclusion shockingly reminiscent of the world-famous 19th century serial killer, Jack the Ripper. When we lifted the skin flap at the nape of the neck, we could see that the whole purpose of that was to access the key joint that would preserve both the head and the vertebral column, she told local news reporters during a horrifying interview. This is not anybody going with a kitchen knife or anything remotely like that. It was well done, and it was perfectly placed. She was dismembered professionally. Another piece of evidence that supported the theory that whoever had severed the head had done so with professional skill was the use of what are known as eye caps. A common mortician's tool, these are devices that resemble contact lenses and are worn in a chillingly similar way. They slip between the eyeball and the eyelid of the deceased person and are complete with small ridges or spikes that maintain the natural curvature of the eye whilst holding the eyelid shut. The pathologists who examined the embalmed head removed these eye caps and found that the person's eyeballs had been removed, but also made a disturbing discovery. The eyeballs had been replaced with small red, rubber bouncy balls, the kind a child might play with. Whoever had done such a thing obviously had a sick sense of humor and was undoubtedly a very dangerously disturbed individual. For the initial forensic analysis, the embalmed head was sent over to Salt Lake City-based IsoForensics, who undertook isotope testing on it. For those unfamiliar with the technique, isotopes are particles that can be found in the human body that come from drinking water that can be traced back to a particular geographical location. When the results of the isotope testing came back, investigators were able to conclude that the woman had spent the previous several months being something of a nomad, having lived or at least stayed in areas including West Virginia, Western Maryland, Southern Pennsylvania, and even as far as Eastern Ohio in New York State. Yet, despite there being evidence to the owner of the severed head having lived in so many places, there was little to show that she had ever lived in Beaver County during the time leading up to her death. However, the use of embalming fluid meant that determining the exact time of death was almost impossible. It also made DNA matching next to impossible, as the fluid destroyed nucleotide bonds that enabled such analysis to be undertaken. The small amount that was obtained was so damaged that it could not be matched to any other samples in the national database. But much to the relief of those involved with the analysis, it was discovered that there was no criminal element to her death, but that cardiac arrest was the most likely explanation for her demise. This was due to toxicology tests that had shown that there were trace amounts of lidocaine and atropine in her system, which are both varieties of medication that are used to treat irregular heart issues. Most likely a cardiac arrest, but not completely confirmed. One homicide detective was said to have been extremely skeptical that the owner of the embalmed head had died of natural causes, having seen far too many cases in which the possessiveness of the killer was displayed in their willingness to tamper and toy with the body of their quarry. When interviewed by journalists, Beaver County Coroner Terry Tatalovich Rosie said, "Could it have been someone with a great deal of anatomical knowledge? Yes. Could it have been someone who is just peculiar or bizarre? The answer to that question is also yes. We just don't know at this point." Michael O'Brien, the borough police chief, claimed the embalmed head was found so far off the road that it was entirely impossible that it could have simply been thrown from a passing car. It was also determined that the scent and flavor of the embalming fluid would have made the flesh very unappealing to scavenger animals, so there was little chance it had been dropped by some hungry fox. The placement was deliberate. Someone had wanted it to be found sooner or later. A number of funeral homes that associated with the Pennsylvania Funeral Directors Association were contacted with pleas for information, and details of the bizarre case were even shared at a National Funeral Directors Association conference. But unsurprisingly, no one could shed any light of the gruesome situation. Pretty much every theory with the exception of grave robbery had been dismissed, with many agreeing that the most likely explanation is that the owner of the embalmed head had been a victim of the black market trade that deals in the illegal acquisition of human remains, either for professional or recreational purposes. There's a black market on body parts, and that market is pretty extensive, Beaver County District Attorney Anthony was reported to have said. Detectives have repeatedly stated that they believe the head may have been removed from the corpse of a natural causes death by what's known as a body broker, an individual or firm who purchases and sells cadavers or remains. One solid reason that this line of investigation is thought to be the most plausible is because the black market cadaver industry has been linked to similar abuses in the past. Due to a plethora of firms where you can purchase human remains, any attempt to discover where the severed head came from is, according to Professor Michelle Vitale, extremely hard to track. If the owner of the severed head is to ever be identified, it would almost certainly require the assistance of a dentist. The forensic investigation discovered that the owner of the severed head had work done on every single tooth, one of them as many as 7 times. On one of 3 teeth that had been pulled, forensic dentists discovered a filling compound that wasn't available to dentists before 2004, indicating that the woman must have died after that particular year. So far, analysis of the woman's dental work has produced no leads, but with a forensic facial reconstruction, investigators still hope that someone someday will be able to identify the woman and give her name back. Almost 6 years later, we are still no closer to discovering the identity of whoever owned the embalmed head, or that of the sick individual who had severed or stolen it before replacing the eyeballs with red rubber balls. It might well remain a total mystery who exactly placed the head in the woods out in Pennsylvania, but perhaps the real question is, do we really want to know the whole story behind it? Or are we more likely to sleep easier, remaining in blissful ignorance? David Glenn Lewis was born in Borger, Texas in 1953, the second of 2 children to Herschel and Esther Lewis. In 1972, he graduated high school and went on to attend Texas Tech University, where he excelled academically, graduating as an honors student in political science. David stayed in academia following this, gaining a place in the Texas Tech Law School, studying until 1979 when he earned himself a jurisprudence doctorate. He chose Amarillo, Texas, to begin practicing as an attorney at law and was a distinguished member of the American Bar Association. Then, just 3 years later, in 1981, he met and married his wife Karen, who gave birth to their daughter a short time after. David was a steadfast family man and became a pillar of his local community. He was a member of his local church, regularly contributing a portion of his disposable income to its upkeep. He was also a district chairman of the Boy Scouts of America and sat on the directors' board of the DeMoss Community Education Advisory Council. He had a happy, successful life full of love and community spirit, but something dark was looming on the horizon, something that would baffle both professional and amateur sleuths for years to come. On January 31st, 1993, David's wife and his 9-year-old daughter arrived back home from a shopping trip to Dallas to find the house empty. It was Super Bowl weekend, and there was a blank tape in the VCR that had been set to record the game, but it had never been turned off. There were some sandwiches sitting covered in the refrigerator, and they appeared that they had been made that day. Everything in the house seemed to be in order, and there were no signs of any kind of foul play that might explain her husband's absence. It simply appeared that David had gone out for a while, maybe been caught up somewhere. It was Super Bowl weekend after all. There was every chance he had simply gone over to a friend's to watch the game. However, the later it got into the evening, the more Karen started to worry. David hadn't called, nor had he left any message telling her where he'd gone. By the time she went to bed that night, she was worried sick. The next morning, when he still hadn't arrived home, Karen drove over to Amarillo Police Department to report him missing. Meanwhile, around 12 hours after David's wife was having police file a missing persons report, over 1,000 miles away in Yakima, Washington, there were several sightings of a strange man walking down the center of a Route 24. The individual's behavior was so alarming that a handful of drivers actually turned around in order to warn people coming the other way that there was an unhinged person simply walking down the center of the dark highway. Many of the motorists went as far as reporting the person to the police, who dispatched highway patrol officers to search for him. But by the time they found the individual, they had been tragically killed in what appeared to be an accidental hit-and-run. The dead man in question was middle-aged and was wearing military-style clothing along with heavy work boots. The subsequent autopsy showed no sign of alcohol in his system, and it was something of a mystery as to who he was and why he was acting so strangely, since there was no form of ID on his body whatsoever. He was simply listed as a John Doe, and a point was made to discover the man's identity, although due to the nature of the death, Washington State Police were in no rush to do so. Back in Texas, on the day following the filing of the missing persons report, police found David's red Ford Explorer abandoned outside of the Potter County Courts building in downtown Amarillo. Beneath the mat under the driver's seat, police found the keys to the truck, along with the keys to David's house. The truck's glove box also contained his credit cards, driver's license, and checkbook, all apparently in the usual place where David was known to keep them. But despite such a find, it gave police no real clues as to his current whereabouts. Where he could have gone from there was simply a mystery. There was one incredible pertinent piece of information to consider, though. The fact that before he had disappeared, David had confided in his wife that he believed his life to be in danger. She pressed him on the issue, but David refused to reveal any more information, not about the nature or the urgency of the threats, since he believed sharing such knowledge would put her life in danger too. When talking to the police, Karen told them that she suspected this threat to be related to his work as an attorney, that some kind of angry or dissatisfied client of his had blamed him for a failure on his part, possibly resulting in a prison sentence, and wished to seek revenge. Karen had dug through David's case files and discovered an appointment dated for a week after his disappearance. It was a deposition in a conflict of interest case between his former law firm and a wealthy client. She had also spoken to David's father, who confessed that his son had also spoken to him regarding the appointment. He had told his father that he had absolutely no intention of covering up any of his former firm's misdeeds, and that he was going to reveal the truth of the matter to all involved. Despite the police considering this a worthy lead, there was simply not enough information on specifics and individuals to produce any serious new evidence. Yet a short time later, police did make a noteworthy discovery: the receipts for 2 plane tickets purchased in David's name that were bought around the time that he'd vanished. The first ticket was for Amarillo to Dallas, probably the means that he had used to escape whoever was threatening him in the first place. The second ticket was from Los Angeles International back to Dallas, a flight scheduled for the very same day the John Doe body was found in Washington state. But just exactly how David intended to use them is unclear. Who was he looking to fly out from LA to Texas? Someone who could protect him from those who wanted blood, perhaps? These were frighteningly important questions, but none could be answered. So with no more leads to follow, the investigation into David Glenn Lewis's disappearance was closed after just under a year's worth of work put into it. Then, 10 years later in 2003, a Washington homicide detective by the name of Pat Dieter read a series of newspaper articles called Without a Trace, which pertained to missing person cases around the country. One of the details which piqued his interest were the repeated mentions of the flaws in the National Crime Information Center's computer system, which was believed to be responsible for many missing persons slipping through the investigatory cracks. Pat actually started Googling various characteristics of some of the missing people, including David Glenn Lewis, and before long, he found something very interesting coming out of Washington state. It was a picture of the John Doe's body from the hit and run in 1993, and it looked shockingly similar to a picture of a still living David. The only difference was that David wore glasses, and there was no mention of the John Doe being found with any. But it only took a little more searching before Pat Dieter was able to find a list of personal effects found on John Doe's body, and bingo, a pair of spectacles was included on the list. This had to be more than just a coincidence, so Dieter got in touch with Amarillo police and arranged for them to be sent a series of items that were kept as evidence from the hit and run, including a boot and a tissue sample. Amarillo police contacted David's mother, arranging for a DNA sample from her to be taken so it could be compared to the John Doe's. And so it came to be that in October of 2004, almost 12 years after he first went missing, the hit-and-run victim from Route 24, a highway that was over 1,500 miles from his hometown of Amarillo, was identified as none other than David Glenn Lewis. But just why exactly was he so far from home? There are so many unanswered questions regarding what exactly happened to David Glenn Lewis that weekend, and just how he ended up all the way in Washington state. Texas police have asserted many times that David left his home of his own volition, and that there is absolutely no evidence of any dodgy dealing or threats against his life. But David's wife and father insist this is not the case, telling journalists and private investigators alike that they had never seen their beloved David so utterly terrified in his life. They theorized that David had intended to hide out on the West Coast for a while, as far away from civilization as was physically possible, hence the military-style gear intended for survival. When it was safe to do so, it is thought that he would travel down to California before flying back to Texas. Some believe the hit-and-run on Route 24 was simply a tragic accident. Some even suspect it was him ending his own life, that he had deliberately ran into traffic to end it. But there are some who even darkly suspect that he was somehow tracked down by a network of powerful individuals and murdered to keep him silent. And the scary thing is, that conclusion is not entirely out of the question. In the aftermath of his death, all the conflict of interest cases surrounding his firm simply faded into nothingness. All the trouble he seemed to have been causing went away. His death ended a sticky situation that could have ended in tens of millions of dollars in damages and fines being paid out. The murder of a man would be a small price to pay to avoid such penalties. The one thing that leads us to believe that David was being followed as far as Washington is the fact that he seemed to be unwilling to rent a car once he was there. He was on foot when he died, and had no rental documentation on him that may indicate he rented, then ditched a vehicle. If he was scot-free and untraceable all the way up in Washington, it would have been no big deal to rent a truck to get around easier. But that wasn't the case. In the end, he was walking up and down the middle of the highway in the dead of night, in all likelihood trying to stop a vehicle so he could hitch a ride out of the area. There is no doubt in my mind that anyone with their headlights on traveling down an open highway would not have seen David walking towards them unless they were either extremely tired or extremely drunk. This raises the question, who exactly hit David that night on Route 24, and why haven't they ever been found? From what I can tell, every investigation into the driver's identity came up short, and this is very possibly due to the fact that the driver then escaped Washington State having completed the contract hit they were assigned to. But regardless, we may never find out what really happened to David Glenn Lewis, why he was killed, or the true motivations for doing so, if he was even murdered at all. Many questions need answering, some that David's family have spent thousands of dollars trying to get the conclusions to. But we are only left to wonder if there is some tragically innocent explanation, or something much more darkly sinister at work. Demetrius Griffin Jr. was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, and had recently started high school. He had piercing blue eyes, rare for an African American, and was said to be very polite, to the point that he had a way of just endearing people to him, especially the adults he cared for. His former middle school teachers remembered the young man as being somewhat of a joker, the kid who always seemed to be making his classmates laugh one way or another. But generally he seemed to be remarkably dissimilar to other boys his age. He was gentle and generous, with a sportsmanlike spirit about him, and never once got into any playground fights, opting instead to befriend those around him and shine a little light into what were otherwise rather dreary lives. He was well motivated and excelled academically, having particular talents for math and science. He seemed especially excited to start high school and to enter the next chapter of his life, having a dream to take part in the various competitions that the high school's swim team was involved in. In order to keep their young son safe, Demetrius's parents imposed a strict curfew on him, one that he kept to without fail. But on September 16, 2016, Demetrius and a friend of his were walking home from high school together until they had to part ways a short distance from his home. However, this was the last time anyone saw him, and hours rapidly passed by with him missing his curfew. Demetrius's mom said this was so unlike her son that she instantly knew that something was amiss. The next morning, at around 1:30 in the morning, police responded to reports of a dumpster fire not far from Demetrius's home. Once the fire was put out, firefighters made a horrifying discovery. There was a body inside, charred to a crisp and almost unrecognizable. But it was quickly determined through DNA sampling that it was Demetrius. He was in such a terrible state that it took the medical examiner's office nearly a month to determine the cause and manner of death, but it is unsurprising that it was decided to be a murder. The young man's family and friends were puzzled as to who could have done such a terrible thing to him, as he had never had any conflict or obvious enemies in his local community or at school. According to his family, the case was quite the opposite. Demetrius loved his neighborhood and would often assist with his neighbors with things like carrying groceries or walking their dogs. He was most definitely not affiliated with any gang or organized criminal group, or so his relatives attested. Yet, his loved ones had suggested that while Demetrius wasn't personally involved in a gang, he might well have fallen victim to one. What happened that night might well have been a case of mistaken identity, or involved some kind of gang initiation, whereby someone who wanted into the gang may have had to kill an innocent person as a kind of sick pledge of allegiance. Others have suggested that what happened that night was a hate crime similar to that of the murder of Emmett Till, the teenage boy who was brutally lynched in Mississippi for supposedly whistling at a white woman. Whereas some speculate that Demetrius had fallen victim to some kind of a social predator, someone who attacked and kidnapped him before disposing of his body in what potentially could have been some variety of indecent assault. Someone robbed the life of a member of the local church, the local boys and girls club, and a prospective member of his school's swimming team, and police were absolutely stumped as to who could have done such a terrible thing to such a bright, innocent young man. However, it is also worth pointing out that Demetrius wasn't the only victim in Chicago to have been found murdered and burned to a crisp in a dumpster. 9 years previously, in 2007, 2 women were found throttled, naked, and dumped in a burning trash can near Washington Park within just days of one another. The first woman was found to be 21-year-old Teresa Bunn, who was heavily pregnant at the time of her death. Her body had been doused in flammable liquid before she was set alight. A little more than 24 hours later, a second victim just 2 miles away from where Teresa was found was also discovered in a chillingly similar manner. The second woman, who would be later identified as 52-year-old Hazel Lewis, was discovered by firefighters who were responding to calls regarding the dumpster fire that her killers had attempted to dispose of her in. There was obviously some painfully clear similarities between the 2 victims, such as the fact that both were women of African American descent. Both were found within a few blocks of Washington Park on Chicago's south side, and both had been asphyxiated before being burned. At the time of the murders, Chicago police spokeswoman Monique Bond reported to the local media that investigators were looking into the possibility of the murders having been committed by a potential serial murderer. Almost 15 years later, both Teresa and Hazel's murders remain completely unsolved, and since then, there have been several more murders in which victims of all ages have met a similar fate. Could Demetrius Griffin Jr. have fallen victim to this very same killer, and if so, the dumpster fire killer could still be roaming the streets of Chicago looking for the next victim. But until another murder and burning occurs, or until such a person is apprehended by law enforcement, Demetrius's death will remain yet another unsolved mystery. "30-year-old Mateusz Kawecki was from the small village of Hutkau in southeastern Poland. In 2018, he and his father were living and working as a construction worker in the German city of Hanover, and had been doing so for around 5 years. Migrating over the border to Germany put a lot of strain on Mateusz's relationship with his long-term girlfriend, who was pregnant with his child, and living in a small village named Lipia Góra in northwestern Poland. Mateusz was desperate to be the best father possible, hence why he has uprooted his life in his native Poland to earn a considerably more lucrative wage in neighboring Germany. In light of this, he had promised the mother of his firstborn child that he would do anything and everything he could to be present at the birth. Then, on March 28, 2018, after a long 9 months of pregnancy, Mateusz got the phone call he had been waiting for. The mother of his child, who by that time was his fiancée, had just gone into labor. Mateusz jumped in his 1998 BMW 525 and took full advantage of the absence of any legal speed limit on the German Autobahn to tear across rural Germany in the direction of the Polish border and his fiancée in Lipia Góra. It was 11:30 p.m. when he got the news, and at 402 miles, the drive across Germany would be a long one. With Mateusz set to arrive in his girlfriend's home village at around 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. the following morning. Yet despite his dedication to be there at the birth of his firstborn child, Mateusz never arrived in Lipia Góra. When later questioned by investigators, Mateusz's father claimed that he received a call from his son on the morning of March 29th. It was around 10:30 a.m. when Mateusz told him that he had been stuck for around 2 hours in a heavy traffic jam around a place called Szczecin, a town on the Polish side of the border that's just over 100 miles from Lipia Góra. At around the same time, Mateusz also sent a text message to his fiancée stating that he was approximately 2 hours away from arriving and that he hoped he would make it in time for the birth. This was the last communication the construction worker sent before he seemingly dropped off the face of the earth. As the hours went by, Mateusz's fiancée got closer and closer to giving birth, she became increasingly worried at his unexplained absence, especially when, for some apparent reason, he was unable to answer her calls or texts. The fiancé grew frantically worried, already intensely stressed by the birthing experience, and ended up contacting Mateusz's sister at around 5 p.m. that same day. She said the same thing, that she had been calling her brother's phone almost non-stop, and whenever she could actually get through, the call would ring out, as if there was simply no one there to pick up the phone. This was deeply concerning for all involved. To everyone's knowledge, Mateusz was still in the car, within arm's reach of his phone. Even in the unlikely event that he had stopped to eat or fill up on gasoline, he could have been able to at least answer or return calls. In their eyes, something pretty dreadful must have happened to keep him from seeing the birth of his first child. So later on that evening, Mateusz's mother called up her local department of the Polish police force, but since he had been missing only a matter of hours, they essentially refused to file a report on her behalf, since it was more likely he would turn up. Yet days later, there was still no sign of Mateusz. His baby had been born, and his fiancée, as well as his family, were worried sick about him. They made efforts to report him missing to police agencies in both Germany and his native Poland, but German law enforcement refused to begin an investigation since their Polish counterparts had already commenced one. One thing that was obvious throughout the entire investigation is the blatantly uncooperative attitude displayed between the German and Polish police. Not only did they seem unwilling to share information or work together in any kind of coordinated effort, but each seemed to take the attitude that it was the responsibility of the party to bear the brunt of the investigative efforts. For example, Mateusz's family asked Polish police to locate his cell phone as a starting point for their investigation, since it was apparently still switched on for a few days after he had initially disappeared. But the Polish police were unable to get a ping off the SIM card since it was under the control of a German-based carrier. Then, when they contacted German police with regards to the cell phone's location, they discovered they couldn't be helped either since Mateusz had disappeared on the Polish side of the international border. Then, after some investigation on their part, Polish police claimed that at no point did Mateusz's phone connect to a Polish network and questioned whether or not he had actually crossed the border into Poland at all. Growing incredibly frustrated with the floundering investigation, Mateusz's family began their own private investigation into his disappearance. They enlisted the help of concerned friends and family members, as well as private investigators, the plan being to thoroughly and intensely search the entire route from Hanover to Lapia Gora. They made a point to drive up and down side roads, asking for copies of CCTV tapes at roadside businesses and talking to employees at gas stations. They took with them pictures of Mateusz, showing them to everyone they could in the hopes of jogging some memories, but not a single person recognized his image, nor could they provide any useful information. 6 months went by, and there was still no sign of Mateusz. What was all the more confusing is that it appeared that not only had he himself vanished from the face of the earth, but so had his car and his phone, the former being not so easy to hide or dispose of. In those 6 months, his family appeared on Polish current affairs and news programs, appealing for information and complaining that the police on either side of the border were not doing nearly enough to find their missing relative. Then on September 12th, with the family quickly giving up hope of ever seeing Mateusz again, a neighbor of his mother called over to their home to ask about the family barn. The barn was pretty close to the neighbor's property, and they suspected one of the animals it housed had died during a cold snap, since during the warmer parts of the day an extremely unpleasant smell could be detected when in close proximity to it. Mateusz's mother checked the situation out, but found that all their animals were alive and well. Yet the smell persisted. The barn in question had a walled-off section that served as a storage space for farm equipment, but the brickwork meant that there was a small kind of ceiling to the structure. Since every part of the barn except the small ceiling had been searched, Mateusz's mother, along with the neighbor, used a ladder to climb up onto it. What they discovered horrified them. On top of the brickwork was what at first appeared to be a pile of clothing. There was also 2 hangman's nooses hanging from the rafters, and what seemed to be a backpack of some description near the pile of clothes. But as soon as one of the pair shined a flashlight over the mass of clothing, they discovered it was actually a human corpse, still clad in the clothes they had died wearing. Although the corpse was far too decomposed to be recognizable, it was clear that the head had been severed from the body. I know the conclusion seems obvious, but we have to remind ourselves that Mateusz wasn't headed for Hutkow, his home village, but his fiancée's, which was on the completely opposite side of Poland with a whopping 370 miles between them. His home village was in no way on the route to Lapia Gora, and there was no reason to believe that he could have been anywhere near Hutkow. Nevertheless, and to the heartbreak of his family, the body was determined to be that of Mateusz. Yet shockingly, the cause of death was deemed that he had taken his own life. This was completely absurd given that one of the young man's shoes was found in the barn, with a severed foot still inside. It was also discovered that some of his teeth had been knocked out, and he was stuck in his clothing in a mass of dried viscera. Whatever happened to Mateusz had obviously involved violence and dismemberment in some form, and the family was outraged that such obvious clues could be so negligently overlooked. While it's entirely possible for the skull of a hanging body to become detached after dangling for some time during the decomposition period, the knocked-out teeth were a dead giveaway that something was seriously amiss. Perhaps one of the most curious details surrounding the items left behind on the brickwork ceiling is an empty bottle of orange juice that was found in the backpack. Mateusz's family insisted that he didn't like orange juice or citrus in general, and that this was strong evidence that he had been murdered by someone who had then disposed of the empty bottle inside of the backpack. Though Polish police refused to take this up as a serious clue, and apparently didn't bother to check the bottle for fingerprints or DNA material at any point during the investigation. But the most prominent mystery of the entire case, aside from the events surrounding Mateusz's actual death, is what happened to his car. The 1998 BMW 525, which he traveled out of Hanover in, has never been found either in Germany or in Poland. Neither were the car keys or the vehicle's registration, which in theory should have been in Mateusz's wallet, which was actually found in the backpack left in the barn. What's more is that despite reappearing in his home village at some point, no one saw Mateusz or his car. For all intents and purposes, it appears he somehow infiltrated his home village in order to end his own life in his family barn. But there is obviously so much more to the case than that, and the reasons for him taking his own life, especially given that he was a new father, are extremely spurious. Both the Polish police and state prosecutor insist that Mateusz's death was in fact him taking his own life, and have since declined to investigate any further, even in the face of insistent appeals from all of his family and friends who assert that the whole thing has been a gross miscarriage of justice. Whether or not this is them being in denial over the idea that their loved one did indeed take their own life is another question entirely. But if it were me, I would certainly be suspicious of some of the details discovered by police, and entirely frustrated by their seeming unwillingness to investigate seriously. Mateusz was a new father, had a loving fiancée, and was doing extremely well in his chosen construction career, so there's little reason to believe that he had those sort of ideations to end his life. But then again, given the insidious nature of depression and mental illness, it is a possibility that we can't entirely rule out, despite the evidence to the contrary. Given the refusal of the police to further investigate, we may never, ever find out what really happened to Mateusz in the aftermath of his immediate disappearance. And if it is indeed the case that he was murdered, and him ending his own life was staged to deter investigators from pursuing a suspect, it's entirely possible that his murderer is still free to roam around Central Europe at their leisure, feeling a grimly smug feeling that they have literally gotten away with murder. There is something beneath the feet of those that walk through the towns and fields of mainland Europe, something they may not even know is there. They have been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, This is the story of the Erdstall. The Erdstall are a series of tunnels that snake through mainland Europe in a huge network. Just over 2,000 have been discovered so far, but some think the true number could be double or even triple that figure. The largest concentration has been discovered in the southern German state of Bavaria, with many of those winding their way into neighboring Austria. Historians and geologists alike have noted that there seem to be a few distinctly different varieties of Erdstall, but with unifying factors that confirm that they are all indeed part of the same amalgamation of tunnels. They are all said to be incredibly narrow, most being only half a meter or so wide, with incredibly low ceilings of around 1.5 meters. The longest of these oval-shaped tunnels is around 160 feet, and in most cases, there is a large room at the very end where there is something resembling a bench-like structure carved into one of the walls. A large percentage of these have what is known as a slip, a point where the tunnel descends into a deeper level that happens to be even narrower than the regular tunnels. These sections are completely impassable to any larger travelers and mark the Erdstall as a rather complex and fascinating construction, given that there is obviously some level of intelligent design having been put into them. For each Erdstall network, there exists only one single solitary point of entrance. These entrance points are often concealed or deliberately camouflaged in some fashion, which suggests the tunnels were used by some group of people to hide. The entrances can be found in all manner of places, some more ominous than others. For example, while some of the entrances can be found in seemingly random places like wooded areas or under the kitchen of a German farmhouse, others are concealed near graveyards. Perhaps the simplest way for archaeologists to determine the purpose of any particular Erdstall room is to catalog whatever was contained in it, which is generally where the mysteries start to unfold. A huge portion of the Erdstall has next to nothing inside them. There is also little evidence that anything was ever inside of them, and the Erdstall tunnels don't have tire tracks for a minecart, any human remains interred inside them, or detritus from day-to-day life that might prove they were lived in. Although there have been incidents of dead weights and plowshares found in the tunnels, this is extremely rare, and we can safely rule out that they were used for storage. In fact, archaeological evidence is so few and far between that historians have had a rather difficult time even figuring out exactly when the tunnels were constructed. Trace amounts of charcoal have been found in a handful of tunnels, and carbon dating have been used to determine that they might well have been dug out between the years of 950 AD and the late 12th century. Another curious part is that there are absolutely no written records of the Erdstall until at least hundreds of years after they were dug out, and those that constructed them left nothing in the way of written evidence as to exactly why they were built, nor who commissioned their construction. A common trait among archaeologists who study medieval ruins or structures is that, whether they're stuck for the reasoning behind something, they assign a religious significance to it. The logic being, if the reasoning seems off-kilter, there must be some kind of religious zealotry at work. But strangely enough, this model of explanation doesn't quite fit the Erdstall tunnels. By the time they were constructed, Germany and its neighbor Austria were pretty much completely taken over by Christianity, and this came with a well-practiced tradition of monks writing out and recording significant historical events. Surely, given such a mammoth construction project, this would have included some mention of the Erdstall, unless of course it was a closely guarded state secret, or they had been instructed not to make any record of them, lest such records fall into the hands of an enemy nation. However, there is another theory, that they were dug by people who wished to continue the worship of their old gods, who were persecuted by the Christian majority and were forced to worship their idols in complete secrecy. But if that really were the reason for the construction, surely there would be some kind of trace iconography, perhaps a few relics or other artifacts left behind as evidence. But that's still not to say that these might have been purged at some point when the tunnels were discovered. Another theory that has been suggested is that the Erdstall were used for defensive purposes. This is a pretty solid theory given that when an enemy army stopped by your town to do some casual pillaging and wanton destruction, it'd be very handy to have a secret tunnel complex to be able to hide out until they got bored and moved on. Yet despite being so plausible an idea, there are a few holes in this theory. As was mentioned previously, there was only one known entrance to any of the tunnel complexes, which would make a huge tactical error if the tunnel complex was found by the enemy. Without a secondary escape route, the entire population in the area could be slaughtered and enslaved once the Erdstall was found. On top of that, given the tunnels were so narrow and small, oxygen would have been in very short supply if they were occupied by a large number of people. It could be possible that the aforementioned slips could have been used as a kind of oxygen trap, so that when the air ran out, people could simply move to the next level. But that's still not feasible to hide out in such a confined space, so we can't safely say that the Erdstall was purely a defensive structure. Although, in hindsight, it gives us a decent idea of why this would be shoddy planning, we should seriously keep in mind that human beings have a rather amazing capacity to make terrible decisions, especially when under duress. While the Erdstall may not have been the best form of defense, I could see how someone, especially someone in fear for their life, could be talked into the idea of hiding out there in the face of a vicious and bloodthirsty enemy. The relatively brief period in which they were constructed only cements this whole theory. As news of their inefficiency became known across Europe, people would simply stop building them, hence why they were only built during a certain tight time frame. Despite our final Erdstall theory being technically religious in nature, given its nature it might well be categorized as a more spiritual explanation. It has been suggested that the previously mentioned slips could be considered as a series of ritualistic birth canals. The pious could have themselves squeezed through the narrow slips as part of an ostentatious rite of metaphysical renaissance, in a manner that might be carried out to rid a person of disease or misfortune. What a truly horrific and terrifying fate that would be, to have to drag yourself through a narrow, dark, dingy tunnel whilst being racked with disease before being forced to crawl up through a slip as a way of simulating your own rebirth, all alone, deep down in the earth. This religious ceremony theory might well explain why there is absolutely nothing in the way of physical evidence in the tunnels, given that they might be expected to be completely bare, as not to distract the subterranean pilgrim from their reason to be there. It might also stand to reason that, since this may have been considered unorthodoxy or heresy by the Catholic Church, no record of it was written down. It seems like we have covered many of the more reasonable explanations as to why these tunnels were built, with the academic community arguing over a few small details but not the larger picture. However, some have suggested some far-flung terrifying ideas to explain the Erdstall, the most terrifying being that they were home to some kind of proto-humanoid race that was wiped out as part of a wider effort to wipe out heresy in the newly Christian Europe, that they were built and maintained by a race of humanoids considerably smaller than Homo sapiens, who lived under the feet of our ancestors for a brief period before being discovered and promptly exterminated. While being extremely outlandish, this is no doubt a spine-chilling theory. But the fact remains, we may never really know why the Erdstall were constructed or who ordered them to be dug, and despite them being a huge, albeit secret part of the European subterranean landscape, they'll probably remain something of a mystery for as long as there are people to wander about them. There aren't many of us who are unfamiliar with the tale of the Pied Piper. The story is simple. The town of Hameln is being plagued by hordes of rats, when a mysterious piper shows up declaring he can save them from the skittering masses of vermin. The townsfolk offer him an obscene amount of gold to remedy the situation, and the piper plays a special tune on a flute that causes all of the rats to follow him out of the town, where he leads them into a river and drowns them. Upon his return to Hameln, the piper finds the townsfolk refuse to pay him, judging his feat to be too easy and therefore unworthy of payment. In revenge, the piper plays another tune on his flute, one that entrances the town's children to follow him, whereupon neither they nor the piper are ever seen again. Yet what most of those who know of this story don't seem to realize is that this is no legend, and appears to be a very real event that actually occurred in Germany during the 13th century. There is a place in the town of Hameln known as the Pied Piper House, a place that hosts a plaque dating 1602, which states that A.D. 1284, on the 26th of June, the day of St. John and St. Paul, 130 children, born in Hameln, were led out of the town by a piper wearing multicolored clothes. After passing the Calvary near the Koppenberg, they disappeared forever. There are also historical records of a stained glass window in St. Nikolai's Church dating to the early 14th century, depicting the Pied Piper leading the entranced children away. It is inscribed with the Latin words, "On the day of John and Paul, 130 children in Hameln went to Calvary and were brought through all kinds of danger to the Koppen mountain and lost." On such account, known as the Lüneburg manuscript, and thought to be written in 1450 AD, tells of a monk who claimed that a musician in his late 30s who wore multicolored clothes came to the town and led the children away while they were in some kind of hysterical trance. There is also an account of the event in the town's ledger dating 1384, which states that it is now 100 years since our children departed. What's interesting about these accounts is that the date of the event in question is always the same, the feast of St. John and St. Paul, or 26th of June of 1284, and that the number of children who went missing is always the same. In which case, what actually happened in Hameln, Germany, on that fateful day? There are those who have theorized that the piper was actually some kind of recruiter who was organizing migrants, pilgrims, or military recruits, one that utilized his colorful clothing and pipe to attract potential recruits. Certain historians have claimed that the story is a metaphor for a plague that came and killed off the children, and the piper is simply a kind of metaphor for death itself. However, a BBC documentary from a few years back has put forward a theory involving something called dance mania. The dance could spread from individuals to large groups, all driven by an unshakable compulsion to dance feverishly, sometimes for weeks, often leaping and singing and sometimes hallucinating to the point of exhaustion and occasionally death, like a top that can't stop spinning. Horrifyingly enough, there happened to be a well-documented case of the aforementioned dance mania just south of Hameln, in the town of Erfurt, during the 13th century, when a handful of the townsfolk's children actually danced themselves to death by exhaustion. An additional theory revolved around the date the children disappeared. Besides being a Christian feast day, June 26 was the date of the pagan midsummer celebrations. Many historians have claimed that the children were being taken to the festivities when a local Christian faction either intercepted the group and slaughtered them or kidnapped them and forced them to convert to Christianity. In all likelihood, what really happened in Hameln will forever remain a mystery, one that continues to fascinate and terrify those that understand the implications of such a real-life event. Because as we've learned, it was no legend, but something that continues to haunt a place that actually suffered through such a tragic and horrifying event. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And I'm cheesed to meet you.